Well, welcome everyone. I'm here to talk about one of Philip K. Dick's novels with you. It'll be The Man Who Japed, published in 1957. This edition of the novel is actually in a British publication of Philip Dick's works, and you can get three of Philip Dick's early novels: Vulcan's Hammer, The Man Who Japed, and Dr. Futurity, all in one edition, which has cost like $10 US. I've gotten some of these British versions since I've come to Taiwan. Just because when you buy these books internationally, they get them from wherever they can, and often it's from British publishers, which you can't always get in the U.S. I don't like them actually. I don't like the way they're put together, but it's cheap. And if you don't like Philip Dick's early novels, but you think you need to read them, this is not a bad choice to get three of them in one swoop. None of these novels are generally that well received by Philip Dick fans. I think The Man Who Japed is the best of these three novels, but there's a lot I like about Dr. Futurity too, and I'll talk about that in the future. Now, I want to introduce the novel, give a brief summary of it, and talk about some of its themes. I go into a lot more detail on my podcast. It's called American Writers 100 Pages at a Time, and I'm doing two things in that podcast. One is I'm really going through the Library of America, looking at the works of great American writers. I'm currently doing a series on James Fenimore Cooper, and then I'm going to be doing a series on Black writers after that. And there's a bunch of content on there already for you to look at. I'm doing that, and I'm also doing something I'm calling the Philip K. Dick Book Club, where I'm looking at each of the works of Philip Dick, the stories, and then I'm doing the novels. Often I'll do the novels in multi-parts. So I already have about 60 or 70 of Philip Dick stories up there. I also have a series on Solar Lottery and a series on The World Jones Made, and I'm just now going to be putting up this series on The Man Who Japed. The Man Who Japed was published in 1957. It was published, it's the third novel he published after Solar Lottery and The World Jones Made. It wasn't the third he wrote, though, and he wrote many novels before that. His mainstream novels, which he never got published weren't published till after he died, and some novels that didn't get published till later, like Vulcan's Hammer. I think that was the first science fiction novel he wrote, but it wouldn't be published till 1960 or so. But these three novels, Solar Lottery, not Dr. Futurity, The World Jones Made, and The Man Who Japed, have three different political systems. And Dick, in a way, is post-Orwellian in that he doesn't just assume a kind of an authoritarian political system. So his dystopias are very creative politically, I think. And he never really is married to one type of political system or one vision of the political future. In Solar Lottery, you have a sort of authoritarian system, but it has, like it's a randomocracy. The president, or the quizmaster as he's called, is just chosen by lot, essentially. In The World Jones Made, you have a system called relativism, where no one is allowed to make a political statement of any sort. That's forbidden. The idea was that war was caused by ideology, and therefore we need to get rid of ideology, so no one's allowed to make a definitive statement about the future. Now, this also, though, shuts off the frontier largely, and so that novel is, in many ways, about the need for a frontier, the need for to go boldly where no one's gone before. Now, in The Man Who Japed, it's a political system called moral relativism. So again, after a war, this time the war gets blamed on social decadence, and you're much more thinking, because the Nazis did the same thing, blaming World War I and blaming the problems of the world on decadence. So that might be on Dick's mind, but the model of moral relativism is more like the Protestant work ethic and the Protestant moral system. It's very much like if the Puritans from the 17th century were in charge, what would that system look like? And he doesn't enforce this system, or the system is not enforced through violence or work camps or executions. It's enforced really in two ways. One is your lease, where you live, and the other is the juveniles, the kind of public shame. The way the juvenile system works is basically the juveniles are like these little robots. If you've seen Minority Report movie, I think the way Spielberg pictured the surveillance state there was these little spidery things. It's kind of like that, if you can imagine it. And they keep tracks on everyone, and if you do something bad, if you drink too much, if you have an affair, if you kiss someone outside of marriage, whatever, you get called before the public, and this video is shown, and you're condemned. And after you're condemned, something might bad happen to you. Now, the main way these block meetings can punish you is by taking away your lease. So by taking away your lease, you're forced to move farther away from the center. And if you're moral, if you're good, you can get a better lease closer to the center of the society, which is called the omphalos, really closer to the core. This is not just you who benefit from this. This is something you pass on to your children. So your moral credit is passed on to your children through your lease. And if you're bad, you go to the health resorts where you're supposed to be cleaned up. And if you fail at that, you get pushed farther and farther to the frontier. Ultimately, you can go off to the off-world colonies where everything goes. They're basically areas that moral reclamation has not yet reached. So the lease and the public shaming work together to enforce this system, and they really don't need work camps at all. Now, you also do have a propaganda engine called telemedia, and they're basically responsible for delivering messages about morality to the public through what are called packets. They're essentially propaganda campaigns. Now, our main character in the novel, and spoiler alert, I'm going to give you the gist of the novel. It's kind of a quick and easy plot to talk about. The main character, Alan Purcell, is basically a subcontractor of the government who makes these propaganda packets. And he's a very creative guy. He's actually later on it's discussed that he's the only person in the society that still has a sense of humor, one of the few who still has it. So early in the novel, he gets a promotion to essentially be the head of propaganda for the government, the head of telemedia, because the previous guy retires and he's going to go off to the frontier himself to retire, get away from it all, so he doesn't, too many ulcers. He doesn't really want the job, and we learn why. And we learn why is because he has a lot of hesitation about the whole MOREC system. MOREC is the new speak for moral reclamation. He doesn't really care for it that much. He has a lot of hesitations about it. Deep down, he's an individualist, a humorous guy. He hates the whole system of morality and moral surveillance. He does some weird things, though. He comes home drunk one day. He loses a bit of time. And he destroys a statue of the founder of this society, Major Strider. And he actually destroys it by cutting off its head, reshaping it so it looks like it's punting his own head. And he doesn't know why he does that. He eventually goes to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist tries to figure out why he did this. He looks up the lost time, repairs those memory blocks. And what he actually did during that time is he talked to some kids, and the kids talk about how they want to go to the frontier. They don't want to inherit the lease from their parents. They would rather go off to the frontier where they can be free. He tries to buy an illegal bottle of scotch. And it's I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it's kind of interesting how he tries to do that. And then he goes to Hokkaido, which is one of these devastated places where smugglers and kind of counterfeiters and people live. And there's a group of people there, some friends of his, one named Gates, one named Sugarman, who his job is to dig up like pornographic novels or other banned literature and sell it. And like they even have a copy of Ulysses. And a big deal is made of that. He doesn't buy anything, but he drinks like four glasses of sherry and comes home drunk. He's publicly condemned for this in one of his meetings, but he's trying to figure out what's going on. So he goes to the psychiatrist. Eventually, the psychiatrist kidnaps him because he thinks he might have psi power, and they take him to the colonies, to off-world, where they kind of construct a fake life for him, where he's married to someone else, he's living a life as a swinger, and he doesn't feel right about that, so he leaves that. He gets away, he escapes, and he goes back to Earth just in time to start his new job. Now, he's been gone for a week, and there's suspicions about what he was doing and where he was, and some people think he was having an affair. On his first day of work, Gretchen, who's the psychiatrist's sister, comes to visit him and tells him what happened and kind of confesses everything, and then tries to kiss him. All of this is recorded by the juveniles. So on the next Wednesday, or I think it's 2 days later, on Wednesday, he gets called before the block meeting, and he loses his lease. He still has his job, though, but the next day at work, he's told he must resign. He doesn't resign. Instead, he keeps his job, and he can keep it for about a week before the final firing can be done. During that week, he japes Major Strider, and he does this by having basically a television program that's presented as a historical documentary, and what's revealed is that during the revolution, during the rise of moral reclamation, the Major Strider and his followers ate their political enemies. The people that couldn't be redeemed were eaten. This was called active assimilation. So you assimilate the enemies by eating them. It's a big joke, but of course it's presented as truth to the people, and it gets out there. Now he's fired at the end of the story, but he is not executed or dragged to a prison camp. He just goes to the colonies and lives out his life there. And he admits he's the one who destroyed the statue. That's the novel. That's all that really happens in it. It's a really quick read. It's only 140 pages. Okay, again, a quick read. I think Philip Dick fans should read this novel. It's even something that Dick mentions in Exegesis, at least in the published version, what we get, what we have, what's been published by Leatham and who's that other person? Whatever. He mentions it on one page. He kind of puts it with another group of novels dealing with false reality and false histories and past. And he kind of puts it provisionally, like maybe this novel had a bit of this theme in it. So Dick at least thought it was important enough to mention in the Exegesis, which, if you don't know, is a bunch of writings he did after he had these weird things happen to him in the mid-70s. Anyways, some of the themes of this novel. This is really where this novel shines, because the characters aren't that memorable. The plot is really, it's just not much involved. The only science fiction element in it really is the fact that they have interstellar travel, and it's kind of after a nuclear war. And the autofact, and I'll get to the autofact, the use of the autofact in this novel in a little bit. But I just want to give you some of the themes. I'm going to talk a lot more about them, or I do talk a lot more about them in my podcast version. So I'll put a link to it below, and then you can go there and listen to my 6-part series on this story if you want to have a little bit more of what I have to say about it. But anyways, the first theme I want to talk about is the frontier. Dick writes in this early part of his career in the 50s a lot about the frontier. He's almost obsessed with the frontier. Novellas like The Variable Man, short stories like Mr. Starship, The Souvenir, the novel The World Jones Made. Even Solar Lottery has a whole subplot about a group of people trying to find the 10th planet of the solar system to settle. The need for a frontier is on his mind constantly. Maybe this is because he's a California writer. Maybe it's just in the DNA of science fiction at the time. I have a whole episode about the frontier on my podcast called Philip K. Dick and the Philosophy of History. It's not the full philosophy of his history. I think it's a stage in his view of history. He goes on, and later on he has a kind of idea of an eternal return, a secular view of history. But early on in his career, he very much believes in the need for a frontier. In this novel, the frontier is presented as the opposite of moral reclamation. So the less moral you are, the more pushed off to the frontier you are. And we get a brief vision of it when he goes and kind of lives out this secondary life for a couple days on another planet. One is they have big suburban houses. It's very much like 1950s America. People live in houses that are too big for them. They shop a lot. And that's an important thing I'm going to get back to, is the whole question of shopping. But they shop too much, and they're non-monogamous. That's another thing. Is there's a little bit of a manufactured conflict within this fake marriage he has, where his wife slept with someone at a party and he got a girl pregnant. And it's very subtle. It's just talked about a couple times. But that's there in the background. And it seems they're swingers out on the frontier, and they nude sunbathe and things like that. So it might be kind of a teenage fantasy, a male teenage fantasy to a degree, but this is how Dick presents the frontier here. And then the closer you get to the center, the more morally constrained you are and regulated you are. So the frontier, generally, I think for Dick in this time of his career, is a place for rebirth and renewal. It's kind of this classic American frontier, the kind of stuff you see in frontier literature in the Wild West and all that stuff. Just to quote the book briefly, quote, "This was not Morex society because there were no swimming pools and wide lawns and separate houses and glass-bottomed buses in the Morex society. There were no people basking in the sun in the middle of the day. There was no game called quart, and this was not a vast historical exhibit such as the 20th century houses in the museum, because you could see the date on the magazine being read across the aisle, and it was the right month and the year." A second theme would just be moral reclamation altogether. It's the ideology of the society. It's based on the Protestant work ethic, essentially. And Mater Strider is a South African of Dutch descent, so it's a religious conservatism, if you will, and barely based on kind of Christian morality. We already talked about how it's enforced, so I don't need to go back over that. But I think it's interesting that this society has such an obsession with the work ethic. It really comes clear when he goes to the frontier, because this idea of people like sunbathing during the day or shopping during the day is something that's kind of horrific for people from Morex society, because they don't do that. And it seems shopping itself is condemned. Now, how is consumption done in this society? And that gets me to the next theme, which is the autofac. Dick kind of has the autofac in many different contexts. In fact, he wrote a whole story called the autofac. It's just the robot factory, if for lack of a better phrase for it. It's what we can call, it's technological post-scarcity in general. It's where machinery, robots can do all the work, all the necessary work can be done, or production at least can be done by machines. So then the question becomes, how do you distribute goods if you don't have labor needing to make it anymore? And this is, of course, the whole issue of automation and some of the questions we're thinking about in our society as, the threats of AI to employment, and how do we deal with that? Do we use a universal basic income? Do we create new jobs? Do we create BS jobs, bullshit jobs like David Graeber suggests? But it's interesting, in Morak societies, you have the autofac doing all the work, and you have people who don't shop, so consumption is suppressed. Yet there's a work ethic, so everyone is required to work. How does this manage? Well, it seems the way it's managed is through bullshit jobs. Work is created for people to do. And there's a lot of busy work and a lot of office work and a lot of cultural production like telemedia does. So how he manages the autofac is something that we want to look at as we study Dick's work, because he takes it for granted, technological post-scarcity. But how you get to the distribution side of it and how you keep people employed, and what's the meaning of life when you don't need to work anymore. And of course, this reaches the ultimate in Galactic Pot Healer, one of his novels from the later 60s, and in my opinion, his best novel. Okay, another theme that we can look at in this novel is the media. Of course, our main character is a media producer, a producer of media. He gets his job as the head of a propaganda engine, and just how the media is represented. And Dick plays a lot with this idea of the intention of a piece of propaganda and how it's received. And there's like one of his works is criticized, one of the main character's works is criticized early on because it shows like a tree dying in the frontier. And he thinks it means you got to stay close to the core. You have to be Morak, even if you live on the frontier. But the way it gets read by his bosses is, this is going to undermine our agricultural policies in the frontier because we're trying to promote agriculture, and you can't show plants dying in the frontier. Another theme is monogamy. Of course, in Morak, monogamy is strictly enforced. Marriage is enforced. It's part of how, we actually see people being charged at block meetings for sex outside of marriage. But on the frontiers, this doesn't seem to be an issue. So it's something that Dick's going to play with in different ways in a lot of his stories. Sometimes it's straight up stories of adultery. Sometimes it's stories about, like in the Game Players of Titan, for instance, where marriages are kind of, wives are bought and sold and traded. Some societies, there's really no enforcement of monogamy, and others there are. So it's something that's on Dick's mind a lot, and he plays with it a little bit in The Man Who Japed. We got a lot here on psychoanalysis, of course. Dick was a consumer of psychoanalysis. He was very much interested in it. He wrote whole novels about psychoanalysis, certainly in Martian Time Slip and The Clans of the Alphane Moon are novels almost entirely about psychoanalysis and its use and its consumption. The Simulacrum, too, has a lot on that. This novel has it as basically the alternative to Morak is mental illness. So anyone who's not morally straight, to use the Boy Scout term, anyone who's not morally straight is mentally ill and needs the care of mental health professionals. And if they fail at that, they're sent off to the health resorts, which at their ultimate are the off-world colonies. So that's one take on it. And again, this is the theme that Dick comes back to again and again and keeps playing with and looking at in different ways. And then a final theme that's important in this novel is censorship. Censorship in the sense that these novels are suppressed. Now, Dick was writing at a time where states still banned novels. It wasn't until the early 1960s, or maybe it was 63 or 64, that you have the Naked Lunch case, and where I think it was in Massachusetts, where Massachusetts Supreme Court determined that they couldn't ban the publication of the novel Naked Lunch. Something that's not overtly pornographic, something that presents itself as literature, cannot be suppressed. Movies at the time were still being banned. Well, not banned, but you had an oversight agency that could cut out certain scenes or enforce what could be put on screen. This was before the rating system emerged in the 70s. We got rid of that film censorship and replaced it just with the rating system. But back, from the 30s to the 70s, you had this, I forget what it was called, but it was a board that would watch over movies. Books too could be censored. Now, the book that's mentioned here, Ulysses, there's a few other novels. I don't know if they're real, but there's a pornographic novel and a pulp crime novel that are mentioned. But Ulysses is real, of course. Now, that was never formally banned in the United States, but there was kind of an informal censorship by the publishers, and they didn't release it in the United States until, I think, 1933 or 1934, when they did take it to the courts, and the courts decided it's not pornographic, we can't ban it, it's literature. But there was some hesitation about it, because there are scenes in Ulysses, of course. There's a scene of a man masturbating in public. There's a woman masturbating on a bed at the end of the novel. So for these reasons, the novel was seen as racy. But anyone who read it knows that it's not meant to titillate. It's pure literature. So that was lifted in 1934. My only point here is that at the time Dick was alive, books were being kind of forbidden, and putting on, banned book lists were a real thing, not just things that school libraries had. Those are, to me, the main themes of The Man Who Japed. I think for me, the core interesting issue in here is how the novel manages the question of automation versus the work ethic. How can you have a society like, frankly, the United States, or Taiwan for that matter, where the work ethic is really core to people's identity and sense of value and sense of worth, combined with the reality that robots can do a lot of this work? How do you have a society function in which we put so much emphasis on your career and the work you do, yet, automation is coming? He manages it here in a very interesting way, and I think, I don't know if that's how we're going to manage it in the future with the bullshit jobs, but we'll see, I guess. So overall, I think it's a quick read. So if you're a Philip Dick fan, reader who hasn't cut to this novel yet, just do it. Just read it. For people who aren't Philip Dick fans or maybe come across this novel in other ways, I think it has a lot to offer. I think it's actually a pretty good segue into the way Dick writes, and you got to get used to this idea that the reality that Dick will throw out a theme and not really develop it, or not really give you a satisfactory answer to it. There are novels that are almost entirely ideas patched together, like The Simulacrum is one of these novels. It's just a series of ideas thrown on the table, and then he just kind of pieces them together roughly. There's really no clear plot in that novel, I would say. Other novels have a more consistent plot, like Ubik or The Scanner Darkly. But this one is more of a thematic hodgepodge, and a lot of his early novels have that feel. I think it should be more commonly read. I think it has a lot to offer, and I recommend it. But if you want to know more of my thoughts on The Man Who Japed, please listen to my podcast series. Again, the link is going to be below, and you can just go to 100pages.podbean.com, and that has not only my reviews and my thoughts on The Man Who Japed, but on a bunch of Philip K. Dick stories, Solar Lottery, and The World Joan Maids. And going forward, I'm going to give brief introductions to these works on YouTube, leading you to my podcast. So I hope you go there and visit, but if not, I'll be back shortly with probably other Philip Dick novels as I read them, and maybe even a few of the more significant short stories. So thank you so much.